Director for the IHSP. Thanks for joining us for the first Policy Talk Seminar webinar of the winter. I think we're really super excited to have our speaker here today, Maya Goldenberg from Guelph. I think I said this at the beginning of last semester when I said I can't think of a topic more pressing or more top of mind, but I think that's true today as well. Talking about vaccine hesitancy, which is really at the top of all of our minds right now, thinking about the rollout. Before we get to introducing our speaker, I just wanted to mention that we do have a great lineup this semester. I think Annie can put a link in there for the events that we have scheduled for the winter. And I'm sure those of you that are on our mailing list have already received these notices, but if you're not, please feel free to sign up. So it's a great mix of people from academia, practitioners, and policymakers. And I just want to give my heartfelt thanks to Annie, Sonia, and Jen, who I think are all here for their hard work in terms of organizing the webinar series and also helping to promote along with our co-sponsors. So before any further delay, I want to thank Dr. Goldenberg for being here and introduce our moderator for today, who's Professor Phoebe Friesen from the Biomedical Ethics Unit and also the Department of Social Studies of Medicine. Phoebe's a fellow philosopher like our speaker today. And I know was very excited to have Professor Goldenberg joining us for the webinar. So Phoebe, please take it away.
Great, thanks so much. So yeah, I'm really delighted to be introducing Maya Goldenberg, who's a philosopher I've admired for a very long time. So I actually, had written to IHSP, when they asked for recommendations for the speaker series, saying, we ought to get Maya Goldenberg, and they said multiple people have already recommended her, so we've already booked her. So I know I'm not alone in looking forward to this talk. So I actually just found out she's a McGill grad, did her master's in the philosophy department and the biomedical ethics unit back in the day, and then went to University of Michigan. So now she works as an associate professor at the University of Guelph in philosophy. Her work spans a variety of topics, but largely has focused on topics at the intersection of ethics and epistemology in medicine. So she's interrogated the ways in which epistemological processes that we have in medicine, evidence-based medicine, randomized controlled trials in particular, carry ethical implications, largely drawing on feminist philosophy of science and epistemology. And in the last several years, she's taken up the phenomenon of vaccine hesitancy, which she's going to talk about today. So she's spoken at a large number of events and written several papers, and has an upcoming book on this topic, which I'm really looking forward to reading. It's called Vaccine Hesitancy, Public Trust, Expertise, and the War on Science. So different talks that she's given on this particular topic have talked about anti-vaxxers, Andrew Wakefield, trust, blame, pediatric vaccines, credibility, and consensus in science and expertise. So to me, those are all, really interesting topics. And I'm really looking forward to hearing what she has today. So in terms of questions, we'll have a bit of time at the end. You can just write the word question in the chat, or you can write your whole question out and I'll read it, or you can raise your hand and I'll call on you. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to you, Maya.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the introductions, to both the introductions. That was very kind of you. It's a pleasure to be here. I wish I was actually there at McGill, but this will have to do for now. So my talk today, the question is this a war on science? And I want to offer a rethink of vaccine hesitancy and refusal. So I've been interested in the controversy surrounding childhood vaccinations for years. This is my area of research, is pediatric vaccine hesitancy, about the sort of routine childhood vaccinations that children get. I started thinking, as an epistemologist, I wondered why people don't accept the weight of the scientific consensus, and also what evidence was going to convince them. And the answer to these questions turned out to be more complicated than I thought. In fact, I was asking the wrong questions. So this kind of side interest in vaccine hesitancy evolved into a long book project, and the research was completed and most of the writing was done before the novel coronavirus was first identified, but the themes that I address, namely public trust in scientific institutions and the problem of expertise, are, I think, as relevant as ever. So let's start with a definition of vaccine hesitancy. Vaccine hesitancy is the feeling of ambivalence about vaccines. It is an attitude, it's not a behavior. The behavior of interest might be vaccine refusal, but vaccine hesitancy, this attitude, it can predict behavior, but it does not guarantee it. Public health scholars agree that we need to keep an eye on the attitude, not just the behavior, in order to protect public health. And this interest in vaccine hesitancy, the attitude, not the behavior, led to the formation of a WHO scientific advisory group of experts, or SAGE group, focused specifically on vaccine hesitancy. So that's the level at which people think it's important. So what I'd like to do today is challenge the way we usually think about or frame vaccine hesitancy and refusal. Frameworks are important. They structure how we view the problem and how we respond to it. So what we're going to do is look at the assumptions and values lying beneath the dominant framework, which I call the war on science, and I will define it. I'm going to assess it, assess its impact, and then I'm going to suggest a new framework that I think is more enabling, which I call a crisis of trust. So let's start with, how should we understand public resistance or public controversies over scientific claims? So things like resistance, public resistance to the consensus on the safety and effectiveness of vaccines, that's just one example. But these kinds of controversies are usually framed in combative terms. So I'm thinking of climate change denial, GMOs, wind farms, fluoridation. These are the kind of public controversies over scientific claims I'm thinking of. In framing of these issues, it's usually framed, as I mentioned, as a combat or a battle, and the combatants are science versus nonsense, reason versus ignorance, and expertise versus non-expertise. And we hear that science, rationality, and expertise are losing the war. The victims of the war, of course, are public health and well-being. And when asked who is responsible for this, it's usually people usually point to members of the public, at least some of them. So when members of the public turn away from science, from rationality, let's say by refusing vaccination or by deprioritizing political action on climate change, they are failing at the task of informed democratic participation. That is the dominant view. And you find lots of examples of this view, a view that I'm going to challenge, but you find a lot of these examples in the many media attending to public resistance to scientific claims. There's so much literature and opining on this. So I looked at academic literature, popular science writing, many opinion pieces and op-eds in newspapers and magazines, and there were definite themes that arise out of them and are perpetuated. So one is that commentators will very commonly bemoan scientific illiteracy among the general publics. This is just one example, a book called Unscientific American. Otherwise, commentators might fret over a destructive cultural embracing of anti-intellectualism or the end of expertise. That's the idea that no one listens to experts anymore. These are very common themes in discussions regarding public resistance to scientific claims. I really did see these themes again and again. And this resistance towards even very strong scientific consensus claims, like what we have on pediatric vaccines, are seen as key problems of our time. We are now allegedly post-truth, post-fact, anti-science, and the culture war on science and expertise only gets amplified when you add a pandemic. COVID-19 is described in this public health paper as the first post-truth pandemic. And the authors of this paper explain it like this. They say, in our post-truth world, the line between facts and opinion fades. Being caught in a lie no longer guarantees negative consequences, and the phrase believing is seeing has transformed from a psychological insight into an accepted way of life. Although the roots of this epistemic crisis are clearly visible in the anti-vax movement and climate change denialism, COVID-19 may be our first post-truth pandemic. So what's being described here as a whole, what I'm calling the dominant view, is a culture war on science and expertise, taking place on social media platforms and impacting us all. So as I said, I want to challenge this dominant view regarding vaccine hesitancy and more generally public resistance to scientific claims. So returning to that previous division, I'm going to argue that it is not a war on science or a war on expertise. I will acknowledge that it is tempting to see it that way. Let's say when members of the public repeat pseudoscience that they picked up on the internet, or when they don't listen to their doctors about vaccines. But I'm going to make the case for an alternative framework to the war on science, which is a crisis of trust, specifically public mistrust of scientific institutions. And I argue this case more thoroughly in my forthcoming book coming out in March. So this alternative framework rests on a different conception of the relationship between science and society. So what is this thing called science, and how do the publics relate to science? And this differently posited relationship encourages different public health outreach strategies, as well as redrawing the lines of moral responsibility for this problem. So I'm going to say that the problem no longer lies squarely in the epistemic failings of the public, but we actually need to look at the institutional framework too, the scientific institutional framework. So let's start looking at the alleged war on science by what is assumed to be the nature of science. So within the dominant framework, what is the nature of science? Whether you think the driver of vaccine hesitancy and refusal is the public's low scientific literacy or some kind of more active science denialism and anti-expertise, these explanations share something in common. It's a grounding assumption about the role of science in democratic decision-making. In both those accounts, there's this thing called science that transcends partisan politics, and a failure to recognize this rightful anchor in liberal democracies is damaging. So I use this image here of a boat and an anchor to capture the assumed role of science in a democratic society, where science provides the anchor for the swells and surges of democratic choice. Now, public misunderstanding of science, the death of expertise, similarly untether decision-making from its rational basis. And it's because of that that the stakes are so high and why the discussions, the online discussions become so vitriolic. So whether it's a war on evidence or a war on experts, public resistance to scientific claims is similarly envisioned. It's a battle between established knowledge and everything else. Now, public health organizations often have good scientific backing for their directives. I think they do regarding childhood vaccines. It's then assumed to follow that public health has exclusive claim to knowledge and to rational policy. It's also assumed that the problem lies in those who cannot appreciate the science and the science-backed policies. That's the thinking about vaccine hesitancy and other forms of public pushback against scientifically backed policies. So I'm going to agree to the scientific superiority of the vaccine consensus view, but I'm going to challenge the other claims that the best policies follow from the best science and that the public are the problem. So I am, as mentioned, working against a popular and admittedly tempting way of thinking about controversies over well-established scientific claims, that things like disagreement over the safety and efficacy of vaccines are a war over scientific evidence. This is a very common perception. It's common enough to make the cover of a National Geographic magazine. That's from 2015. And it's repeated by leaders, politicians and leaders who feel the need to declare allegiance to science. Here is just one example, is the head of the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, where he tearily vowed to uphold science. This was in 2019 when he took that role. And here is Hillary Clinton in 2016 telling the Democratic National Congress that she believes in science. And our own prime minister had similarly expressed allegiance to science upon taking office in 2015. So as I said, this view of the problem is tempting because the description of war on science really seems to fit in a lot of ways. We've got this huge body of literature supporting the scientific consensus. We've got opponents who pick out selective and often disreputable counter evidence. Then we've got the publics who are caught in the middle, who sometimes choose wrongly. And the reason for public resistance to scientific claims like vaccines or climate change is argued to be that the public misunderstands the science, or they lack sufficient scientific literacy. Popular science communicators strongly endorse this view, Neil deGrasse Tyson being one example. And because of that, science communications tend to focus on knowledge transmission, especially debunking myths. Most of our vaccine communications are something akin to debunking myths and fact-driven information about vaccines. And of course, parents do seem to be rejecting science when they explain their reasons for hesitating about vaccines. There's lots of surveys, interviews, transcripts where parents, not just in Canada, but in other English-speaking countries, that was my limit of literature, at least English language literature was my limit, where parents say things like, vaccines aren't safe, vaccines aren't effective, vaccines aren't necessary. So these parents, they make evidentiary claims in direct contradiction to the consistent message offered by their physicians, by public health agencies, and so on. So this framework does seem compelling, but still there is strong reasons to challenge the pervasive explanation that the public doesn't understand the science, that's why we have this problem. If misunderstanding and misinterpretation of the scientific evidence were the problem, you would expect the provision of correct information and education to correct this, but it doesn't do that. There's been years of well-funded education campaigns, and they have not changed the numbers of vaccine refusers. Vaccine communicators will admit to this readily. Vaccine hesitancy numbers are even going up slowly, so maybe there is some effect, but it's certainly going upwards, not down. Another reason to think that poor scientific literacy is not the root of the problem is that vaccine hesitators are known that they tend to be well educated, university degree holders, even postgraduate. So the more likely story is that those with higher education are putting their critical thinking skills to use. Some are reading the scientific papers, and many more are allegedly reading between the lines to see what the establishment doesn't want them to see. So even if we allow for a few missteps in individual reasoning, things like cherry picking the data, misattributing correlation for causation, poor scientific literacy is not the key problem driving vaccine hesitancy. Now, there are some war on science type explanations of vaccine hesitancy that go even stronger than a presumed knowledge deficit where people don't understand the science. They say that education efforts are not turning the dial on vaccine hesitancy because vaccine hesitators and refusers cannot be reasoned with. It's a lost cause. Compulsion is then the only way. Now you see how the war is sort of escalating here. The war of science has also been parsed as what's called the death of expertise. Middle of your screen, this is the cover of a 2018 book by that name, The Death of Expertise, written by the political scientist Tom Nichols. It made it to the New York Times bestsellers list, so apparently convincing was his position that no one listens to experts anymore. In the book, he laments the real-time realization of the Dunning-Kruger effect, this idea that the public think they know better than experts, and because of that, science denialism and irrationalism can thrive. Now, that's more on the popular side of writings, but when I moved towards the academic writings, I of course went right to science and technology studies, because that should be informative. It reaches, this area of study researches those questions about the nature of science, its relationship to society, the status of scientific expertise. And it was surprising to me to see that many scholars, some of our heavyweights in the field, really take up some form of this narrative of science denialism and the public embrace of irrationalism. So that's still consistent with the War on Science framework. So some of the big names in the field, I'm thinking of Latour, Kitcher, Colins, have recently wondered if the discipline's 50 or so years of critical science studies, showing the extent to which science is socially constructed, might have contributed to the current frustrating situation where scientific experts are not seen as more reliable than non-experts, where everybody's got a point, or what Kitcher called a leveling of the epistemic playing field. So I can't talk about all of them, but I will speak a little bit about the sociologists Harry Colins and Robert Evans. They wrote the book Rethinking Expertise in 2008, precisely to address this very problem of the downgrading of experts. And they initiated this new area of science studies working to reclaim the status of experts and expertise. They called it the third wave of science studies. And in the book, they describe, in their introduction, they describe this troubling societal trend towards a distrust of experts. Collins also wrote a popular science book called Are We All Scientific Experts Now?, where he rehashed the arguments from the 2008 book, and he coined this phrase, default expertise, which is this problematic idea that everyone is an expert or no one is an expert. Instead, we have this leveling of epistemic expertise. So default expertise is meant to describe, I'm quoting him, this sense of empowerment, the sense that every citizen is part of the game of science and technology. It is the feeling of a right to judge that ordinary citizens think they possess because science and technology are so fallible. That's how Collins describes it. So default expertise is supposed to explain the apparent reasonableness of telling worried parents to do your research and decide for yourself, and the energy with which some vaccine hesitators take up that challenge. So Collins wanted to save sociology of science as much as he wanted to save expertise. He plied his trade to provide a response to those armchair researchers or default experts, these parents. To do that, he borrows from the periodic table of expertises, that's not a typo, that's what they call it, that he had earlier developed with Evans in that 2008 book I mentioned. And this table, it details the many kinds of expertise that are available to us. Now, he focused just on two. We're not going to do the whole table here. The contrast between two key kinds of expertise, which are primary source knowledge and interactional expertise. They're circled on the table there. Primary source knowledge confers the kind of expertise that an informed non-specialist can gain from reading scientific papers, from reading the primary sources. Interactional expertise is a specialist expertise. It's the knowledge and understanding that comes from being part of the specialist community. So a parent who is well-read because they access scientific papers on vaccines, they can acquire primary source knowledge expertise on vaccines, but that's different and much less than the interactional expertise, which are only garnered by those who are members of the relevant expert community. So only this expertise gives you specialist knowledge, and it is specialist knowledge that is required to pronounce on the knowledge question and claim. So the upshot of this, according to Colin still, is that you can read all the online stuff you want. You can even read the professional scientific literature from the perspective of an amateur or an outsider. You'll absorb a lot of information, but you'll still never have interactional expertise. That's the sort of expertise developed by getting to know a community of scientists intimately and getting a feeling for what they think. It's a very sociological way of talking about science and scientific understanding. Collins explains, if you get your information only from the journals, you can't tell whether a paper is being taken seriously by the scientific community or not. You cannot get a good picture of what is going on in science from the literature alone. So Collins' answer to that question, are we all scientific experts now, is no. Interactional expertise is the key concept. Even if everyone is an expert on some things, that doesn't confer specialist knowledge on everyone. Vaccine skeptics, vaccine hesitant parents will often insist that they are experts on their own children. But that doesn't make you an expert on vaccines, Colins would argue. Specialist knowledge arises from education and work and immersion in the community of experts. So best to leave the judgments of vaccine safety and efficacy to the scientists. All right, so that's what I've just outlined there is how the leading sociologists of expertise reclaim expertise. They tell us that scientists really could do better in communicating to the public and in their policing of occasional transgressions like fraud or misrepresentation. But the heart of the problem, this problem of expertise, seems to lie in the public's confusion about the nature of expertise. Once the public understands that we are not all scientific experts, expertise will be restored and public controversy over scientific claims will end. So the knowledge deficit is thereby filled with a proper understanding of expertise. So in this argument for the special nature of interactional expertise is acknowledgement by Colins and Evans that knowledge arises in community. And this idea that knowledge is social and that science is social knowledge is a key claim in social epistemology. I think Colins' acknowledgement of the social nature of scientific knowledge is right, but it doesn't go far enough. A key feature of this communal or social exercise of knowledge building is trust. That is an important ingredient. That is because all relationships are built on trust. And I want to show that we need to attend to the ways trust figures into the social exercise of knowledge building. Now that's going to get me to my preferred framework, which is the crisis of trust. So I want to bring the issue of trust into knowledge building and knowledge acquisition. So I'm going to take the picture of science as a community of knowers, something that Colins and sociologists of expertise confidently subscribe to. I want to take that in different directions. I'm going to characterize public resistance to science and the so-called death of expertise differently, not as a move towards irrationality or a reflection of scientific misunderstanding or a war on anything really, but rather mistrust of scientific institutions. And to make my case that this is a problem of poor trust and not some sort of poor regard of science, I need to demonstrate the ways that science and trust are linked. So I'm going to be drawing from social epistemology research to present trust as endemic to science. Trust figures in knowledge creation. It figures into managing dissent and disagreement, consensus building, and legitimation of the consensus. Trust pervades all areas of science. Poor trust relations undermine scientific practice and policy. And vaccine hesitancy, I'm going to argue, is a symptom of a trust deficit, specifically poor public trust in medical and scientific institutions. And because, the last part is, because these institutions need public trust to achieve many of their mandates, public resistance to scientific claims is not squarely a problem with the publics, but a problem with scientific governance. And when you think of it as a shared problem, this invites new ways of addressing vaccine hesitancy. So let's start this exploration of public trust in scientific institutions by articulating what is meant by trust. This is a heavily theorized concept in ethics, philosophy of science, in social theory, with particular attention provided by feminist theorists in all of these domains because of the feminist focus on the relational aspects of morality, knowledge production, and social structures, especially relationships involving imbalances of power between participants. So in short, feminist theorists are particularly good on trust. The concept of trust is taken to mean having confidence in someone or something in all of those areas. We sort of land on the same definition. Discussions about trust in the context of science usually refers to epistemic trust. That is to invest epistemic trust in someone is to trust them in their capacity as a provider of information. When we trust a person, an organization, or an institution, we're judging them to be dependable and worthy of our confidence. The philosopher of science Torsten Wilholt has done some good theorizing about epistemic trust, but he's borrowed from the prior moral philosophy of Annette Beyer, who Beyer made the distinction between mere reliance and trust. And Wilholt argues that epistemic trust is not mere reliance on someone. It's more than that. It's the kind of dependence that makes the trusting person dependent on the trustee's goodwill. So this dependence on other people's goodwill will make us vulnerable. We may be misled or harmed by a trusting relationship that goes badly. So trusting others is risky, but it's also unavoidable. We need to trust in order to get along in our lives. And this tension between the risk and the unavoidability of the risk makes the tension ripe for ethical analysis. When we find ourselves in situations where we lack adequate information to know something for ourselves, and this happens often, many, many times every single day, we need to trust others. And we know that risk. We know that trust may be broken. Trust requires what's been described as leaps of faith in the sociology literature under the influence of George Simmel. So this leap of faith refers to the necessary bridging of an information gap in situations of risk. Epistemically dependent people will fill any perceived knowledge gap with a kind of suspension or bracketing off of uncertainties. The confidence with which the trustee leaps is captured in the expectation of the trusted expert's goodwill, or perhaps moral integrity is enough. MacLeod has made that argument. There is the additional expectation that experts will be properly motivated to act, and confidence hinges on not just the epistemic credentials in cases of epistemic trust, but also on the moral character of the person that we trust. So the philosopher John Hardwick spoke of the moral legitimacy of the expert as a prerequisite for rational epistemic dependence. So you might have all the credentials, but if we don't trust you as someone that will speak honestly and act a person who will act in my own interest, I still may have good reason not to trust you. So there's been qualitative research into parental decision-making regarding vaccines that have highlighted the multiple leaps of faith taken in the face of incomplete knowledge and anxiety over future unknowns. So parents' trusting leaps will be taken or they will be denied regarding vaccine advice from relations of a familiarity, our peers, family members, health professionals. So trust can thereby be understood as a means of social cohesion or connection through affective commitments or emotional ties. So what's important for our discussion, just distill this just for the important takeaway, is that it is not the growing mountain of data that are convincing parents to vaccinate their children, but a willing leap in favor of the scientific consensus. Vaccine hesitators and refusers situate themselves in different spheres of familiarity that disqualify the majority view on vaccines. So there's actually a symmetry between these two, the vaccine acceptors and the vaccine refusing parents. It is not the case that one side is scientifically informed and the other side is not informed. Instead, they're making calculations, they're moving towards in-group belonging, they're doing largely what their peers do. This is not well explained. This kind of movement is not well explained by cognitivist perspectives on risk assessment. Instead, Beyer seems correct to describe trust as part cognitive, part affective, and part conative. It is relationship building too. So that is what I mean by trust. And now I'm going to move to a trust within scientific communities. Of course, science is thought to be rigorous by being wary of trust. You don't listen to authority, you examine the evidence for yourself. This is a popular understanding of science that made an alternative thesis that came out of science studies starting around the 1980s seem very radical. The idea that trust relations make scientific progress possible. So going against the Enlightenment ideals of epistemic individualism, where you study for yourself, or radical skepticism, where you trust no one, a compelling case was made for epistemic dependency and trust in science. For example, scientists trust in the peer-reviewed knowledge that supports their own work. They trust their collaborators to do their piece of the project properly. No one has the time or the expertise to do all of the work themselves or to check every claim. This is not to say that hard data and logical argument are not necessary, but that they cannot capture everything that's going on there. Since not every scientist can do the singular effort of testing each claim, much of what we consider to be scientific knowledge is built on relations of trust. Large-scale collaborations are now the norm in many scientific fields, and that illustrates this. Science requires trust between the collaborators. You do your work properly, you do, and I'll do mine. You report honestly, as will I. And the community of scientists that read the published work trust in the peer review. So there's a thread of trust that goes through this thing that we call science. So behind the scenes, trust operates in establishing and legitimating knowledge as true and as a universal, by which I mean true for everyone. Now, if we leave the science community and move into the public sphere, we can carry those themes of trust in science to the science-public exchange. And this is important because this is where vaccine controversy takes place. There's a really good consensus within the scientific community. So when we move from science communities to relationships between science and the publics, epistemic dependency and trust are actually more obvious. Members of the public rely on scientific knowledge to inform their everyday choices, their practices, and because we members of the public don't have the time or the skill to check every claim for ourselves, we will often look to experts for advice. So when the channels of knowledge, translation, and mobilization work well, this move from expert advice to non-expert action can go smoothly. But we're talking about vaccine hesitancy today because the relations between experts and non-experts are not so secure. Members of the public are arguably well advised to defer to scientists with the relevant expertise, right? Those scientists have interactional expertise that makes it likely that their judgments will be better than our own. I think we all agree that the publics benefit from well-placed trust in experts. The challenge is knowing when that trust is well-placed. The risks of harm remain, but we can work to reduce that risk by assessing expert advice. And we do this all the time, we members of the public. So where we members of the public are presumably unqualified to assess the content of scientific claims, if we could, we wouldn't need their advice, we can evaluate the character of the scientific expert or the integrity of the institutions they represent. And that is the kind of second order assessments that members of the public do all the time. Members of the public will follow expert advice if we trust those experts to be epistemically and morally responsible. There's been some philosophical work by Hardwig, by Kevin Elliott and others who've detailed the epistemic and moral qualities that we look for in a trustworthy expert, call it an ethics of expertise. So the rationality for the non-expert publics, the rationality of following expert advice hinges on trust and credibility. Credibility refers to the experts must be trustworthy and non-experts needs to recognize them as such. That's how I'm using the term credibility to mean a perception of trustworthiness. And so relations of trust mediate successful exchanges between scientific institutions and the public, overtly, more overtly than you would see it in scientific communities. Now, relations of trust do not preclude disagreement and controversy. We see that in scientific communities where disagreement is not only expected, because we are a community after all, but encouraged. Dissent and disagreement are commonly seen as signs of healthy epistemic enterprise. It is trust that helps manage those disagreements. The avenues for managing dissent and disagreement in science follow from a generally accepted democratic orientation towards truth-seeking and consensus building, one that is public and accountable. That's at least the ideal of science, a lot of publicity and accountability for ideas. Social epistemologists like Kitcher and Longino, they view these mechanisms favorably and even make recommendations to improve the democratic tenor on science, to make the criticism more rigorous, for example. So you do things like, increase the diversity in scientific communities to make the dissent and criticisms wider and more robust. There's efforts made to limit spurious dissent that is meant to be obstructionist rather than knowledge seeking. I'm thinking of the Merchants of Doubt, those kinds of industry funded doubt raising initiatives. It is with these communicative practices it is with these communicative practices in place that robust scientific consensus can arise on some issues, while points of disagreement can still respectfully endure without rupturing community cohesion. Now, compare public controversies. Science controversies on the public stage are not so well managed. We don't have comparable shared rules for the management of disagreement or for consensus building. We don't have shared frames of reference. We've got facts, alternative facts, which one is legitimate science, which one is junk science. Sometimes there's conflicts of interest on both sides of the argument. And as if that's not enough, and that's already a lot, the science controversy usually isn't about the science at all, but what follows practically from accepting the science as true. So what policies will be put in place? How will they impact my livelihood and sense of well-being? Dan Sarowitz has argued this point, as has Dan Hicks, who's described science controversies as proxy politics for that reason, where we argue about the science, but what we're really enraged about is the values and the implications of that science being accepted as true. So this can be a hard realization for some, that science cannot guide us to good policy and right action, that science doesn't neutralize political partisanship and rationalize democratic decision-making. It is shocking to many vaccine advocates that the scientific consensus on vaccines does not settle public concern. Instead, it gets positioned as one side of a debate where scientific experts need to jockey for legitimacy against disreputable opponents who claim to have the science and the moral credibility on their side. And we should appreciate this surprise. The consensus functions to settle debate, not to invite it, by representing the majority view of those most suited to pronounce on the issue. Consensus claims it can also serve a public function. Sometimes it's meant to educate the public on issues and promote appropriate response, whether that's personal or political. So the failure to achieve these aims, the failure of consensus statements to achieve these aims is no doubt frustrating. Doesn't the consensus deserve more deference? It is, after all, the consensus is, after all, the best approximation of scientific truth. It's produced by the best of science's truth-seeking procedures. The universal applicability of the findings rest in the methods of consensus building. So for the public to suggest some impartiality or bias in the consensus is to reject an elaborate set of epistemic, methodological, and institutional mechanisms meant to ensure reliable knowledge and public benefit from that knowledge. Science, of course, isn't supposed to be something we believe in or that we're against. To say otherwise is to say that science depends on trust. But it does depend on trust. So what's important here is that much of what members of the public know about vaccines pivots on epistemic trust. That same point has been argued about our beliefs on climate change. Ben El-Massi has argued that point. So tied to the consensus statements and the medical position papers are claims to the epistemic and moral legitimacy of its authors and their institutions. Vaccine hesitators and more strident vaccine refusers reject those claims of legitimacy. So what is the appropriate response when the scientific consensus does not fulfill this function of engendering public trust? Well, here's what happens now. Vaccine hesitators and refusers are usually ridiculed for raising concerns, for questioning expert testimony, for taking seriously minority dissenting opinion. Against that democratic tenor of science that people speak of so favorably, science journalists now write articles like this one, this is why you have no business challenging scientific experts. And they do this to convey sincere disgust over the current state of affairs. They wonder why vaccine supporters would take the word of a media-savvy celebrity mom who attributed her knowledge of autism to the University of Google over many scientific experts. Now, we know that the consensus is expert-generated. Its directives are meant for epistemically dependent outsiders. It's meant to offer the scientific information that we need to know. Yet the mechanisms used to ensure the trustworthiness of that information, like the negotiation of conflicting views in academic conferences, in journals, replication of findings, peer review, and so on, these are internal to the scientific communities and therefore largely shielded from public view. And so the final step in that expert-lay exchange, where if all goes well, the publics accept the scientific consensus view, requires some degree of a trusting leap of faith that the scientific experts have done their due diligence and reported responsibly. The trust requirement puts the outsider in a vulnerable position, but there's no sympathy for that. The publics are then implored to trust science, trust in a process whose trustworthiness lies in it being shielded from public opinion and other non-expert contributions. So without an eye on or participation in the innermost practices of scientific knowledge and consensus building, with various threats of sanction for not accepting the findings, the publics are instructed to trust. And some of the publics are just not willing to do so. Now, I know we want to blame social media for this problem. On social media platforms, misinformation proliferates and is amplified in those virtual echo chambers. So when parents make vaccine decisions, those trusting leaps or those refusals are surely influenced by the misinformation peddled on the internet. But those dubious claims only gain traction because they fit with a broader narrative of perilous healthcare. Informed news consumers like these parents I'm thinking of, the one reading the scientific papers, these informed news consumers are well aware of problems in health research and practice. There's lots of news coverage of the replication crisis, the weakness of the peer review system, profit-driven healthcare, profit-driven disease mongering, and lawsuits against pharmaceutical companies. These are part of health consumers' background knowledge when they address the question of vaccines. Parents draw on these narratives when they evaluate new information about vaccine risk. So prior trust will have some determination of whether they accept the consensus view. Informed news consumers also know the varied quality of online information. So we need to ask why these parents do this at all. Why do they look past orthodox sources like the CDC or Health Canada and see what else is out there on the internet? They know they're going into perilous territory, yet there's something about the orthodox sources that is not satisfying their need for information and does not provide the reassurance that they need. The current climate, this is all to say that the current climate of parental decision-making on vaccines is very difficult. Many parents cite this as one of the most difficult decisions they need to make in their, let's say, their infant's or young child's life. There was this report on vaccine hesitancy by the AAAS, the American Academy for the Advancement of Science, a few years ago that I thought nicely describes the noisy public stage on which vaccine controversy plays out and where parents need to make difficult health decisions. I'm reading a quote here: "A welter of voices in medicine, government, politics, media, churches, schools, and among one families and friends can confuse well-meaning parents who want to do the best for their offspring. Online forums where appeals to emotion often drown out thoughtful discussion also play a role in vaccination decisions." That's the end of the quote. So while those dissenting and questioning and confusing voices do make the decision-making process more difficult, it is due to poor trust that the institutions tasked with protecting the public good are not able to carry out their mandate by guiding parents out of the fray and offering the definitive voice of reason. The consensus does not fulfill its function of guiding parents here. There are institutional implications for this. I think everyone agrees that the publics need science. They need good science to make decisions. But my point is that it goes both ways. Science needs the publics too. The fulfillment of many institutional mandates hinge on positive public relations. Science, of course, strives to create universally applicable knowledge, and this knowledge is universal only insofar as it is accepted by its various stakeholders. This places the demand on scientific communities to earn and maintain the trust of the publics. So research institutions and agencies, they do rely on stable relations with the outside, at minimum to ensure access to public research funds and to enjoy little interference with their work. That's the minimal level of public trust that is needed for, let's say, more esoteric areas of scientific research. If that minimal level of public trust is in place, science can operate smoothly. Now, if you turn to policy relevant science, I'm thinking of research motivated by practical goals like furthering human and animal and environmental welfare, there are more elaborate ties to the public. These practical goals require scientific claims to be accepted by stakeholders outside of the specialized epistemic community. Policy relevant science can only provide those public benefits if its institutions are regarded as trustworthy by members of the public. So think of public health. Public health can only improve the population's health if the general publics largely accept and follow their recommendations. Health recommendations, consensus statements, they bank on the public's trust in the institution's efforts to inform and protect us honestly and conscientiously. So earning and maintaining the public trust is crucial for fulfilling public health mandates. Offering the best science and the most carefully considered action directives are really not enough. The science, of course, must be trustworthy, but it also needs to be trusted by all public health stakeholders. Persistent vaccine hesitancy indicates an institutional failure to engender public trust. And this warrants some self-reflection about these institutions and agencies' own trust-building practices. I'll draw some conclusions here so that we can have some time to talk. Okay, just to summarize, I've argued that the evidence most of the publics accept on vaccines turns crucially on epistemic trust. And it's poor trust in the expert sources that engender or create vaccine hesitancy. In other words, the consensus claims won't convince anyone if the source is not perceived as trustworthy. So what if we focused on building that trust rather than educating the misinformed public or puzzling over their moral and epistemic failings? Doing this is not to discount that public health agencies have the science on their side. It does mean that we need to recognize that the best science is not enough. This is not a war with the public. It's not a war over science. I've offered a different picture of science in relation to the publics than that firm anchor mooring liberal democratic political organization. So science should still be understood to hold firm ground. I'm not a relativist about the science here, but the idea that the evidence somehow speaks or directs right policy and right action is a fiction. All evidence is subject to interpretation. All political and policy decisions require numerous non-scientific considerations too. So the language of evidence-based and more currently during COVID, following our leaders, following the science is misleading in that respect. Following the science is not just inserting the scientific evidence into a directive. There's more to it. So scientific evidence, of course, operates within a constellation of social influences that guide personal decision-making and policy formation. So it is a good trust relations that ensures that science stands prominently within policy frameworks. And so good relations with the publics need to be maintained. In other words, if you want to do the kind of work that public health wants to do, you need good relationships with the public. The current tendency of criticizing the skeptical publics for failing to appreciate the primacy of scientific reasoning or the authority of experts does not address the problem of public mistrust in scientific institutions. If anything, it exacerbates that mistrust by entrenching a polarizing us versus them mentality. Okay, that's it. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Maya, for an incredibly interesting and compelling talk. I enjoyed it immensely. So we've got time just for a couple short questions. We've already got one in the chat, which is asking you to maybe say a little bit more about how public trust in scientific institutions can be increased.
Okay. Okay.
Not giving you much time to breathe there.
Yeah, just a sip here. Okay. When in my work, I saw two major sources of public mistrust, and that tied directly into vaccine hesitancy. And one is that the publics are very unhappy with financial conflicts of interest in industry and academic research, those relationships. The parents that have been surveyed and surveyed and surveyed over why they hesitate. There's actually a lot of research, a lot of qualitative research into vaccine hesitant parents. They could not be clearer about it. They say things like, who's cutting corners, whose interests are being served. They don't think that the scientific research is being done with the public's interest in mind. They think, even if they think that vaccines might be generally safe, they're not sure that the science is being done with a conscientious concern about every child, including their child, and that is important. So one major way, this is of course is a big ask, but it's a structural one, is create more division between the biomedical, biotechnology industries and scientific research. The public do not trust it. This has been the case for many years, and vaccine hesitancy is a symptom of that. So for all the kind of ignoring of the problem that the people in academic medicine and politics and leadership do, they ignore it because they're invested in it. If ever you needed a time to rethink that relationship, maybe rampant vaccine hesitancy and the need to, let's say, vaccinate the population against a pandemic, that might be a good time to do it. Another major source of mistrust that does not get enough attention around vaccine hesitancy is medical racism and healthcare injustices of racialized people and populations. It was interesting in my work. One of my sort of key questions when I started thinking that this was a problem of trust and not a problem of science is why is it that all the research and all the discussions indicate that it is white affluent people that are vaccine hesitant and more hesitant than people that do not benefit from the system in the same way? Because if you know anything about the research into trust in healthcare, there is a lot of research in trust in healthcare. You know that people from racialized and marginalized communities tend to be far less trusting of healthcare. So I wondered why the reverse. Turns out it was because the empirical research into vaccine hesitancy has been done almost exclusively on white participants. Social science researchers maybe didn't see the urgency of it, but they would do sort of, use the kind of methods for recruitment where you just, let's say, put up a phone number at a health clinic and you see who calls you back. And if you use this, it's called convenience sampling, you just kind of take who's there, you might end up with skewed samples. And of course they did. White participants are more likely to want to talk to social scientists. So if you want to talk to marginalized populations, you have to go actively recruit, and that wasn't done. So I'd say two structural changes are big rethink of industry relationships to healthcare, and the second one is a lot of engagement of marginalized people and populations, teaching anti-racism in medical schools, affirmative action to get more people of color in medicine in all the healthcare domains, including public health. So that's the more structural stuff. But there's even easier little things you can do. Things like not call people stupid when they when they raise questions about vaccines. Many of the narratives of how people ended up involved in vaccine skeptical groups and communities started with a mother going to their doctor to ask questions about their baby's health and vaccination and feeling shut down or being made to feel stupid or a bad mother for that. And then they go online and they find that. So it seems that I'm sure doctors are busy and we know them to be frustrated to need to have these conversations again and again, but shutting down a mother's legitimate caring concerns about her baby in the healthcare context is reproducing a nefarious epistemic injustice that women are quite familiar with in healthcare. So just there, I would say actually change the billing codes to give doctors more time to talk to their parents. I'm aware, at least in Ontario, that the billing that family docs get to do for vaccination is very small, because it was the amount was established at a time when it used to be a quick conversation. Okay, mom, we're going to vaccinate today. Good. Any questions? No, go. Now it can be a prolonged trust building answering things. So doctors should be able to bill and have the time to do it, because it is so important. So much of it starts with that interaction between parent and healthcare provider, so that you can start small there, changing the sort of doctor-patient relationship, and then you can look at the larger structural issues. Thank you for the question.
Great answer. So I know we are just over time, so people should feel free to go, but we'll just take maybe one or two more questions because I'm so curious to hear. Ian Gold had one.
Thanks, Phoebe. Hi, Maya. Thanks for that. I just found that so utterly convincing and so illuminating. Could I get your opinion about a thought experiment? So imagine there are two countries. So there's Canada and there's, let's call it Canada Star or something. And Canada Star is exactly like Canada. Certainly the healthcare system is exactly like Canada. And all of Canadian Star's people's beliefs about healthcare is all the same and so on. But Canada Star has a different history. So there was no financial crisis, and bankers are really nice people. And so there are all these other institutions in Canada Star that are much better than our institutions. And so as a result, people in Canada Star are much more trusting generally, because everybody is trustworthy. So my intuition is that in Canada Star, people will be less vaccine hesitant because they're more trusting. I mean, if your view is right, and I think it is. And if you agree with that and that's right, then what it shows is that although you've emphasized beliefs about medicine and research and healthcare as sources of trust or mistrust, the other institutions that are in relation both to medicine but also to the populace at large are also going to be relevant. For all we know, other features of society that enhance trust, or maybe even psychological features. Mm-hmm. So do you think that that's right? Do you think that a full analysis, a shelf full of books that talked about vaccine hesitancy would have to look at those larger issues too?
Yeah, it probably would. It's a research project that we'd need a large team to do that, because I use it without apologizing. I use that broad term of the system when people don't trust the system, but that is actually the language that people who go online and discuss vaccine hesitancy use. And they're usually not just talking about big pharma. They're talking about the regulatory system, health research, the government, things like that. That becomes even more obvious, as we've been watching these months of COVID response, where the sort of government and scientific claims just kind of bleed into each other. So yes, it would need a very broad analysis. I wouldn't even know how to undertake something that big. But of course, if we want to narrow it down, we would narrow it down onto the key institutions tasked with vaccines. But recognizing that even those key institutions are many, because vaccines are not just a healthcare technology. They also need to be regulated. They are often mandated, so they are tied to many political structures within our broad system.
Great. So if it's okay, I'll throw two final questions at you from the chat. So one is about compulsory vaccinations and how that might impact public trust. Mm-hmm. And another one about just how we could be more humble with regards to how can we build an institutional language to be more humble and nuanced with regards to the public.
Right. Now compulsory vaccination, it's hard to get around doing that because we will never get the coverage that we need on vaccines by just making it a personal choice. So The good news is you can introduce it in times when things aren't so divisive. So people started talking about, for example, mandates for the COVID vaccine way too early. We didn't even have a COVID vaccine yet. We didn't know how much we would have. Don't start it too early, because of course that's going to get some people's backs up. There are other cases where we introduced, let's say, mandatory vaccines for entry into schools during times when there was, let's say, politically more restful, and it was framed as something that we all do together to protect the community. So, Ontario, for example, has had childhood entry vaccines since the 1970s, and it was not introduced amidst political difficulties. It wasn't done during an epidemic or anything like that. It was kind of understood as a way that we can further a general cause. And I don't think it's impossible that we could actually create a sense of goodwill around vaccines. Vaccines are unfortunately marketed as a personal health decision. I've looked at a lot of the marketing and publications for young parents, and it's always about, this is what you need to do to protect your child and to be a good mother or a good parent, but usually a good mother. And what they lose is the community aspect of vaccines, which of course is vaccines' greatest strength. We need a lot of people vaccinated, not just a few smart moms who vaccinated their children. So it always needs to be done delicately. I think current policies in where we have them in Canada, we do not have anything. We have sort of the measures for people that want to exempt themselves. I actually support those. There's been politics around that in recent years, people saying we got to get rid of these non-medical exemptions because it's letting people off the hook about vaccinating. But you actually need a little bit of what's called a release valve in some of the literature, where if people are so opposed to vaccines, they should be able to opt out. You can make it difficult to opt out, like not just a click on your mouse. You might need to get it notarized and get it, add a few bureaucratic hoops to jump through to get it, but you need to have a little bit of choice. All the while, give clear statements about why the vaccination requirements are important, why they are reasonable, and why they are protective for the individual and the community. And that has been done, and it can be done. Unfortunately, now vaccines are much more politicized, so it makes it much more difficult to talk about mandates. But so in general, I accept mandates when we need it for the coverage, but definitely we need exemptions for the people that want to opt out. Otherwise, you risk driving things underground and further politicizing the vaccine situation.
And
what was the second question, Phoebe?
Sorry, I shouldn't have given you two at once. It's from a physician, really just emphasizing how, we do change our mind with regards to recommendations. Like, how can we be more humble and nuanced in communicating to the public?
I think it's important to, that there's a lot of honesty about what we do know and what we don't know about it. So things like, we've seen this with COVID recommendations have changed over time. And there can be good scientific backing for doing that, things that we didn't know then, now we know this now. And there is a tendency for people to say, well, you see, then the scientists don't know what they're talking about. But that's only because science gets framed as this kind of absolute in politics and in life, that it's supposed to be 100% right. I think a more honest account of scientific practice and methodology would allow for that kind of shifting and an explanation, like why we were originally, let's say, we changed our views on masks. Here are the situations that have created that change. Show the public that you're being responsive to new information rather than changing your mind. So that does require some humility, and some of the literature shows that especially political leaders are very hesitant to admit to uncertainty. They're afraid that if you admit to a little uncertainty, that the public's just going to go wild. Yet I don't think it's very obvious that would happen.
Completely agree. Okay, well, with that, we should probably wrap it up, but just a huge thank you to Maya Goldenberg for a phenomenal talk. And thanks to IHSP for hosting. See you all next time.
Thank you very much. It was
Thanks
a
so
pleasure.
much.